Okay, this lesson is somewhat of a reflection on an account of someone's personal testimony when he was in seminary, apparently very scholastic, a student who was excelling in his classwork, design curriculum. But somewhere in his life, he came to a crossroads, if you will, where the age of the earth, as he was taught the Bible teaches, contradicted or stood in conflict with what he had learned in science or a branch of science. And he then cast away the Bible, and he has a YouTube channel called Paulogia, like apologia, it's Paulogia. And from what I understand, he's very frank about his knowledge, his experience, about his education. He doesn't conceal that. But it was interesting because there's another gentleman, Tim Sledge, who was quite a aspiring pastor by all measures of success, and then a Matt Dillahunty. But anyway, all three of them now are somewhat 180 degree, if you will, turnabout, and advocate rationale and give reasons for atheism being more sound because of the illogic and irrationale of a lot of what they were taught. So I thought, well, since the world of social media is just a meat grinder and whatever's dropped in is like dropping your hand into a pool of piranhas, but what difference does that make to us? In this class, we use the languages. It's our apologetic and outreach ministry of Landmark Missionary Baptist Church in Jacksonville, Arkansas, imcorne.org. And I wrote a quote from the poem, or excerpt from a poem by William Shakespeare, quoting Marcus Aurelius. And he said, Romans, countrymen, lend me your ears. And he said he came to bury Caesar, not to praise him, something like that. So I made a little pun here and said, lend me your ears. I come to bury your constructs, not to praise them. And then instead of Marcus Aurelius, I said, markers are villainous, because I've had a lot of feedback. Some of you didn't know, but there's even been derogatory statements about using markers. One person said, my magic mind and magic markers. Of course, feedback being the breakfast of champions, I'm not sure if I can communicate to the audience in any way that they would understand that it really is irrelevant. I'm really looking for information, data gathering, evaluating, categorizing the data, processing it, discarding narrative that's nothing but, let's say, someone just opining or venting or categorizing or castigating or negating or being, I guess in their mind they think they're being rude or something and using even language, whatever. It's really irrelevant to those of us who do this work, especially for me as a trainer, helping you all study for yourselves. But Paulogia and Matt Dillahunty and then Tim Sledge, they're very formidable, having been, very much devoted to Christ and in every way. But Paulogia especially, it was interesting when he mentioned that the age of the earth, so earth ageism and the contradiction really shook him, because one of the seminary professors that I had in seminary more than once, I returned to seminary for graduate work 10 years later, a decade after I graduated the first time. So I returned, and then shortly after I left the second time, my language professor, Hebrew, Greek, a scholar, unsurpassed, he's probably one of the most diligent students. Well, he had a conflict with earth ageism and moved from old to young, or young to old. Went from old to young, saying went from gap fact to gap folly, for example. Now, that's not a concern. It's just that it struck me as interesting that Paulogia, I don't know his name, I need to look that up, was disillusioned by his teaching of young earth and then his being confronted with old earth outside, I guess, the context of a seminary. And then, of course, Tim Sledge and his books where he explains his rationale for abandoning the faith, and then Dillahunty and his reasons. I mean, they're very good at critical thinking and make very good arguments. But I noticed my seminary professor, so for years he's teaching Hebrew at every level, from the lowest level to the highest, and Greek the same. And for him, his crisis was resolved by just switching from old to young. Okay, so, but he didn't become an atheist. So my curiosity for, like, say, like apologia was, why didn't he just review and revise his beliefs, or why didn't he just hold to his young earthism, and what gave him the idea that it was incredulous? So before I continue with all that, let me look at something about schemata. And I put here a poem by Will Shake Your Schemas instead of William Shakespeare. So that's a little levity there, humor, and yes, and no, I don't mind if any atheist is watching and comes on here and says things or emotes. It's maybe good for them, maybe that day. If they can have me as their attitude object, maybe they can have dinner with their wife or go home and see their parents and have a calmer evening if they can somehow relieve some of that internal torment. But this says, let me get out my large print. Now I'm reading from the Handbook of Human Performance Technology. This field of human performance improvement technology can be applied to anything. I apply it to religion. On page 353, speaking of schema theory, 1980, this author, Ausubel, his schema theory views schemata as providing mental scaffolding containing slots that can be filled in with particular cases. These schemata allow learners to organize information into meaningful units. So the idea of scaffolding, giving a framework for someone to then build later, fill in the blanks, that's very close to what we were taught in our hermeneutics about the error of omission. Some of the blanks are left wanting. And if you don't really know that a fundamental introduction, let's say, to any topic is just core elements. Well, if you don't later go fill that in, well, let's just look at it. Let's look at this scaffolding that was so upsetting or so underdeveloped that it found a scholastic seminary professor, our Greek and Hebrew teacher. He's still there. He's an unsurpassed, excellent pastor, great scholar. It found him switching from young to old, or vice versa, old to young. And then it found someone as brilliant and as scholastic as the young man who has the YouTube channel, or the gentleman, I don't know, I don't speak in a diminutive term, but he speaks of a crisis he had over earth ageism. So let's look at that and see what we could have learned. For example, let's just think of a schematic. Let's just build one. You hear people say young and old. Well, there's blanks there. That's not defined. Number one, what does this even refer to? Is this duration? Well, I'll just go ahead. And is this decay? And we do measure decay. There's an amount, a number, an amount of decay. And then there's literalness, people say. They say they take the Bible literally. Now, I don't know if they know what they mean, but let's just say, for example, literally, they say they believe in a 6-day creation, and we don't have a problem. Let's just keep that ourselves, 6-day creation. But then you have 3, chronology. But there's no contradiction here either. My first introduction to the young earth movement was a younger babe in Christ, if you will, a younger person in the faith, that is. And he came up to me so ardent and so passionate. He said, I believe in a 6th literal day creation. I said, me too. And I think at that time he had heard something that if you believed in gap theory, then you didn't believe in literal days or something like that. It was like a presumptive protasis with a assumed apodosis. So I just said, I don't know what you're talking about. The research parameters in the Missionary Baptist Seminary never found us needing to have more than 12 hours in the day, 12 hours in the night. We never needed more than the chronologies indicated. There is no such thing as G114, that is Genesis 1:14. I'll just move us here. Genesis 1:14, for example, that's referential time. Referential. It's relative. That time did not exist until verse 14 of Genesis. So between 1 and 2, there is no referential time. So whatever we know time to be in the world that we have that was prepared for us as a habitat for humanity, it's not really, it's impossible for us to, being time bound to our time of day is 12 hours night, 12 hours daylight. So that's really not something that we would have to know about. So there's no reason to not have the gap here, because it doesn't negate this, nor the chronologies, nor does it contradict referential time. But you remember, when you're picking sides and you're not really filling out your schematic here, you don't distinguish between Genesis 1:14 referential, I'll just say relative time, since we have referential here. And so the chronologies are intact under both assertions. And to demonstrate it, which is really something that, like I said, my professor, the one that was doing research on the Bible doctrine of time, of course, here's his textbook from 1964, is the year. He had it in 1968. And it's the fundamentals of modern mathematics. And in it includes some of the mathematics and logic. And he is the one that, in the guided research, for example, a colleague, a co-laborer in Christ with me, Dr. A. Johnson, he pastors Sulphur Springs in Hot Springs. We were told use the numbers in the Bible, and we did. So we studied, here's Conquering the Content. It's a really good book to help you take a lot of information and break it down into chunks. But I'll move on quickly and tell you that it never occurred to me until as a research assistant to go back to the big stuff like elementary algebra and go back and fill in the schematic. See, just take this schema here and fill it in. So to use the numbers then, and make sure I've got that, then we just simply 12 hours a day, as Jesus said, and we get 12 hours night. And then we took the 1 day to 1,000 years. Now this didn't happen where, I'll just say, Paul went to seminary. It didn't happen where Dillahunty went to school. It didn't happen where Tim Sledge went. And after school and their training, apparently they never engaged in their own research under a designed with parameters. So, for example, Dr. John Penn, the hermeneutics professor of, let's say, 4 decades at the Missionary Baptist Seminary, he gave us research parameters. He knew there was an equation, formulation, and all this would work out. So we didn't have to discard anything. The only difference you see now is somehow these titles are presumed to stand in opposition. Now, you don't have to get too serious about this because, like I said, I know one of the most scholastic professors, Dr. Mark Thornton, and he is unsurpassed in his language and his knowledge and his hermeneutics and everything. So if to relieve his cognitive dissonance, he just moved from one to the other. He never abandoned the Bible. He never, and nor was I ever taught in the seminary that someone that advocated this, because he pastored churches for quite a while saying the gap is a fact before he began to advocate the gap fallibilities, or the fallible gap. And then we had 1,000 years to a day, 1,000 years to one day. Then we had a 360-day year. And then basically we're done. This was just using this. What would we do? Knowing the difference between time, and then noticing that there was a lifespan, 1.5 here, I'll put that here. People lived within 1,000 years. Methuselah lived up to 969, but no one lived outside 1,000 years. In Psalm 90, everyone, whether young or old, says Psalm 90, and that mentioned Moses wrote Genesis. Peter wrote and referenced part of that, part of Psalm 90. This is where God removed, and it's interesting, in Psalm 90, he removed 90% of the lifespan of 100% of people. So 90% of lifespan of 100% of humanity. Now that's a very large matter. That's how God reduced crime and all that was taking place. So Peter quoted that with the Lord a day is like 1,000 years. 1,000 years is like a day. So we have this here. So again, the disillusionment, and again, the most striking thing I've ever experienced was when people could be so adamant, even read publications from our seminary where gap was a fact and now it's fallible, anyway, I keep getting mixed up because it's that easy, it's that simple. And yet, to speak of the brilliant person that I know Paul to be in the YouTube channel, Paulogia, just set this up as we did, as Dr. Penn helped us and kind of kept us on track. So 12-hour day, 12-hour night. And that was very easy to add that to the 24 hours. And of course, with the 6,000, approximate 6,000 that people work on, try to get a calendar and try to work it out. And I think that's awesome to do that. One day I may care enough to do it. And then I put at approximately 6,250, at 6,250. Because what I was working off of originally was the range of 6 to 20,000 years that had become somewhat of a range by young earthers. To find you to be a young earther, you were somewhere in there. Well, if you look at this, and I'll just do it for those of you that I'm using a different color, well, it left 14,000 difference. And as a process control specialist in an actual world where you want to ascertain the variance, then I just started with the difference. So I took 7,000, since 14,000 was the difference, and I took 7 and broke it into 2. So I started with 7,000 each. So backed up. So I said, okay, let's start at 6,000 and go to 7 for each of these. So what we did, we went back to the drawing board and we started at 250 increments, and that's where we started, is where we ended. This gave us 12,500 years. Then we multiplied it by 360. Because remember, division, time cannot be expressed except in ratio. Ratio is a nice way of saying division. So we multiplied by 360 days. This is that 1 day column here. And that equals 4.5 million days. Multiplied that by 1,000 years. And that equals 4.5 billion years. All you have to do is change your unit of measure from days to years and add 3 zeros. Very easy. And then, so this is the amount of accrued decay, why the earth is so old in such a short amount of time. And then when you correct the gap assumption by clarifying the fact that there is no referential time there, this does not exist within the gap. Those are two different things entirely. And then again, this would have been something Paul would have never been exposed to. And most people aren't. Like I said, the most scholastic in the seminary that I've ever known, that is my age. I think he's just a little older than me, but someone my age that I actually sat under as a student, he couldn't have built a better argument for the gap. And to this day, his work in that is still credible, and he didn't contradict scriptures or twist or anything. But again, unlike Paul of the Paulogia YouTube and his ministry now that advocates atheism, he didn't abandon the Bible. He just moved back and forth between the two assertions, which are almost saying the same thing, but most people can't hear when you're advocating one side over another. And then, of course, to show you, if we want to do the 1,000 years per day, and we take the, let me find some room. Here we go. I'll just make some room here. We'll take the 4.5 and multiply it by 1,000 days instead of 1,000 years. But 1,000 days is approximately 2.78 years. Give me a multiplier. Well, that equals 12.5 billion. That's decay. That's how much decay there is. So people really, if you don't define your terms, you don't distinguish this, and you can see how self-evident it is. It's just that it's so elusive, because unless you're trained, as we were in the holistic hermeneutic approach of Dr. John Penn, who developed this hermeneutic himself through trial and error, did his own work, his own research. He took what worked and discarded what didn't. He made his own applications. He guided us through this research. So Dr. Eddie Johnson and I have no regrets knowing all this. And it certainly doesn't hurt anybody's feelings for someone to know what it would look like if you included everything. And then, of course, in my training as a human performance technologist, this leaving all this other data off by just saying young or old, well, under old, according to the Bible, if you're talking about the amount of decay, and why are we dying 10 times faster? So I really don't have anything except great admiration for Paul of Paulogia and Mr. Dillahunty and his work, and then Tim Sledge. I really admire their crisis in their faith. That is, I don't admire that it happened, and I would like to have thought them to be more resilient, as my teacher, Dr. Mark Thornton, was. He might move back and forth here, but he certainly doesn't abandon the faith, nor does he accuse people of whichever column, you might say. But now, if you notice, according to this, and let me get my large print version out, it says that these contain slots. It's just scaffolding. But you notice most people's scaffolding is very much wanting. It's just a few thumbnail parts of information. Well, this is what the holistic approach does. So, and I can teach this standing flat-footed and don't need a board and don't need notes or anything. It's just use the 360-day calendar, acknowledge the 1,000-year lifespan. And I noticed in some of the young earth advocates, more or less the apologists of young earth, they even talk about how the environment of the earth after the flood has an atmospheric catastrophe in which the oxygen level in our atmosphere now is much lower than before the flood. And so they're saying that the earth has now been oxygen deprived. Animals die more quickly. They even say that the dinosaurs embarked the ark to escape suffocation in water, only to disembark to now suffocate. And that's why they're not here, because they could not receive from the oxygen deprived atmosphere. So they suffocate anyway. But if you listen to them without ridiculing like some people do, and you learn to be a critical thinker, and then to be that you need to be a critical listener, you'll hear that they're speaking of accelerated decay rates. So Noah began building the ark in his 500s, and I doubt if he was on a walker and needing assistance at 100, and then 4 centuries later be so decrepit. So yes, in a way, you could say it, as I try to illustrate it for people to clarify it, is if you saw a person before the flood who had lived up to, let's say, 930 years like Adam, and then you saw a 93-year-old today, you couldn't distinguish them. You wouldn't know which one had that much duration, because they both had incurred the same amount of decay. So for apologia, Brother Paul, Brother Dillahunty, and Brother Sledge, I just wish they had known it. Not that it would have prevented the outcome and where they are today. It's just that when someone as brilliant as Paul, who now has his own YouTube, Apologia, and he mentions the age of the earth, when something this doable and this knowable was there, but it had never been availed, it simply boils down to, and came down to the fact that people sometimes so codepend upon their original scaffolding. It's just there's a lot more there when you actually fill it in. It's like someone, and I'll just stop babbling, but when people don't distinguish between decay rates, and Dr. Al Mohler, for example, he noticed that the earth appears very, very old, and he says it's the consequence of sin. Well, of course. And we have a ratio. And when apologists for young earth speak of the collapsed canopy and the atmosphere and all the oxygen deprivation as they have constructed and trying to build a theory, well, we can just take the numbers in the Bible and notice the rate of acceleration of decay that they all acknowledge. So when you listen as a critical thinker and you listen critically, and I don't mean as someone to criticize, but to critically listen, you start having a trained ear, and you begin to ascertain elements that will fit into those slots, into your schemata, and then you can, flesh it out, if you want to call it that. You can populate it with a number. But our research parameters, and Dr. John Penn was more than convinced, we don't need to go outside the Bible, just use the numbers we have. So this is why I say, lend me your ears. I come to bury your constructs. Actually, what I mean by bury is fill them in. See, fill them in with all this information. And I don't want to praise the original, because for some people it's just young or old. And that's really the only interest they have. They don't have anything else to say. And that's okay. If you don't really want to study the Bible, it's nothing. I have no problem with that. In most organizations I've ever worked in, maybe as high as 80% of the people involved had no interest in the actual subject matter knowledge and didn't intend to acquire subject matter expertise. But for Paul of Apologia, I just wanted to make sure that he was made aware of this. Not to persuade, but just so he'd know that when he deals with young earthers or old earthers or whatever he's dealing with out there, that there is information in between. There is scaffolding that's beyond the construct. There is a schemata that is filled out, that's literally buried with data. So enjoy this and relax, because again, I have not had anything in my faith shaken or troubled by even the most unsurpassed scholar of hermeneutics, Bible languages. He's a faithful father, husband, brother in the covenant, co-laborer of Christ, and yet he's seen the view and defended the view from both vantage points. So where was he wrong? Because if he now doesn't suggest that both can be true, what was it that convinced him otherwise? So it's really not a question of veracity. It's not a question of integrity or credibility. It's a question of how it can be difficult to synthesize data like this. And Dr. Penn taught us that there's a synthesis in the scriptures that's already there. And of course it's there. And yes, in ratio, it's in the math that is the math of all the math that the theologians themselves acknowledge and was already there, scripted. that's already there. Inverse relationship between division and multiplication is a universal fact. So it's real easy when you just put it up there. So that was it. I just want to make sure that, now I don't think Paul Apologia will ever see it, or Brother Dillahunty or Brother Sledge will ever notice this, but if you want to get word to them, it'd just be interesting, because even if they criticized it and ripped it apart, at least I would know as a trainer, especially those of you that work in this class with the Bible languages and even welcome and invite all the data, and have learned to flesh out, if you will, populate your schema, take your construct and fill in the slots, or as we would say, fill in the blanks. And the only struggle is we just don't know how many blanks we have in our schemata, in our original scaffolding. We don't know how many tiers there are. So when we go and retrieve data, that's what we're doing. So you have a blessed day and enjoy this study. And again, if you're bouncing back and forth, it probably won't hurt you if you'll just switch sides and build a case, build a rationale for it from this view, and then come over here and build one from this view. And you might begin to hear an echo. You might start recognizing some things are being said. And when I heard a young earth advocate explain the accelerated death rate after the flood, I wanted to say, well, he's saying the same thing as the ratio says, because our lifespans have been reduced, and it's been obviously measured. So you have a blessed day and enjoy the study.